Hey, what's up everybody? It's Izzy from PowerliftingToWin, and in the last installment of this video series we talked about the critical training variables that you need to manipulate in order to satisfy our core principles of proper powerlifting programming. So namely, we talked about intensity, volume, and frequency. We only talked about these variables in relation to one another. So what we're going to do in this video is talk about how these puzzle pieces fit together in the larger context of an actual powerlifting program. In other words, this video is going to be about organizing actual powerlifting training. Milan Jovanović's concept of the 3 levels of programming planning is going to be central to our discussion. So at the first level, we have the competitive plan. Now we have to base this on the realities of the calendar. When is the next meet? How many weeks do we have to prepare? What are our training objectives? And several other factors that we'll soon discuss. At the second level, we arrive at periodization. Periodization is the process by which we organize, combine, and plot the training goals of the competitive plan. For example, in a powerlifter's off-season, in between meets, the early emphasis might be on muscular hypertrophy. As the meet draws closer, however, the emphasis would likely shift towards improving maximal strength. The exact length of each period, the transition between them, and the particular level of emphasis on any one physical quality is the very essence of periodization. Now finally we arrive at familiar territory with the third level, and that's programming. By my definition here, programming entails manipulating volume, intensity, and frequency to produce the training effects that the periodization plan calls for. In order to better understand planning, I think it's useful for us to work our way through a number of hypothetical powerlifter case studies. So we're going to begin with the novice. Now Mark Rippetoe was responsible for pioneering the idea that novice, intermediate, and advanced athletes all need different periodization lengths in order to optimize rates of progression. By Rippetoe's definition, a novice is a lifter who can go to the gym, set a PR on Monday, and by the time Wednesday rolls around, they can do it again.
So as you can see from this chart, every time you do a workout, your performance actually goes backwards for a while because you accumulate fatigue. And when you accumulate fatigue, you can't perform as well. However, with a novice, that fatigue completely dissipates and provides a super compensation effect in time for their next workout. So if you study this chart carefully, you'll notice that every single workout comes exactly at a new peak in performance because a novice can fully recover between training sessions. No other trainee can do that.
Now, in terms of planning, the plan for a novice is always the same. They need to improve everything. The primary focuses are going to be technique, strength, and muscle mass. In terms of periodization, it is just completely unnecessary to organize a novice's training into distinct phases of emphasis on, say, muscular hypertrophy, maximal strength, or technique. A novice can, and indeed should, improve all of these physical attributes simultaneously. Even combined, the total volume will not be enough to overwhelm their adaptive capacity. Improving all of these qualities simultaneously is called complex parallel periodization, and that's going to be important for our discussion going forwards. Now, when we talk about programming for the novice, it's completely unnecessary to manipulate intensity, volume, and frequency in a given training week or training period. A novice, in terms of programming, simply needs enough volume to produce an adaptation for the next workout and not so much volume that they can't recover for the next workout. So you just want to make sure that they're sustaining linear progression. Now, in terms of intensity, a novice is best served by working in the 80 to 85% range. Lately, and perhaps traditionally too, sets of 5 have been used for this purpose, and sets of 5 are very appropriate for novices. 5s offer a nice blend of strength and size without being so many reps that it introduces a muscular endurance component that often interferes with proper technique development in the novice. Returning to Rippetoe's definitions, an intermediate trainee is one who can no longer sustain workout-to-workout performance improvements. Unlike the novice, the level of volume they have to do to produce an adaptation cannot be recovered from in 48 to 72 hours. As such, programming variety becomes necessary. That is, we must start to manipulate volume, intensity, and frequency.
Alright guys, so as you can see, this is the intermediate version of the novice chart that we saw earlier. The workout that they do on Monday produces so much fatigue that by the time Wednesday rolls around, you can clearly see they're still not fully recovered. But by next Monday, a full week, their performance is super compensated and they're ready to go through the process again. This is Ripeto's definition of an intermediate.
Now, the competitive plan for an intermediate trainee is markedly different from that of the novice. By the time a trainee reaches the intermediate phase of strength training, they should be preparing for powerlifting meet. However, in terms of periodization, not much has to change. The complex parallel approach is still completely appropriate. It is unnecessary for the intermediate to have specific periods of focus on muscular hypertrophy, technique, or maximal strength. Manipulation of volume, intensity, and frequency is all that is necessary to sustain progress. Consider the Texas method.
The Texas method is a really simple program where on Monday you do 5x5 at about 80 to 85% of what your Friday squat is, and on Friday you do a single set of 5 as heavy as you can. Wednesday is a lighter day that allows for recovery. But you can see that Monday serves as that big volume stimulus, and then Friday you capitalize on it with a PR.
So at this point, I need to introduce the concepts of meso and microcycles. For the novice lifter, each workout and the following recovery period constitutes an entire microcycle and mesocycle. In the Texas method, each individual day, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, constitutes a microcycle, whereas each training week would constitute a full mesocycle. You can easily see how we could apply this to a 3-week version of the Texas method, where week 1 was volume, week 2 was a light week / a recovery week, deload, and week 3 was an intensity week where you could go for PRs. In this example, each week would be a microcycle and each full 3-week wave would be the mesocycle. Ripeto's definition of the intermediate trainee ends when they can no longer make progress on a weekly mesocycle. However, I prefer to define an intermediate as anyone who can still use complex parallel periodization to make progress. While the novice, intermediate, advanced categories are incredibly novel and quite useful in some contexts, the truth is that adaptability exists along a continuum. For example, in the early intermediate phase, you may only need 5 days to complete a full adaptive cycle. But by the time you're in the later intermediate stages, perhaps you need 7 days, and then 9, and so on. The relationship between volume and recovery is not only different for everybody, but it is constantly changing as an athlete makes progress. For all of these reasons, defining trainee classification based on the length of their meso and microcycles quickly loses utility in my opinion. Like I said before, I prefer to define an intermediate trainee as anyone who can make progress on all physical attributes simultaneously and equally, so long as volume, intensity, and frequency are properly manipulated. Eventually, an athlete will reach the point where continuing to develop all of his physical qualities simultaneously requires such great volumes that it's just physically impossible to do so. While it is true that an athlete's recovery capacity improves as his training career progresses, it does so in absolute terms. There's an upper limit to recovery for everybody, and when this point is reached, you cannot simply just add more volume. Now, when most athletes hit this point, they turn to performance-enhancing drugs in order to artificially raise their recovery limitations. However, there is an alternative. You can increase your periodization complexity using something called block periodization. Block periodization is simply a form of training organization where particular periods or mesocycles are dedicated to specific physical attributes such as maximal strength, muscular hypertrophy, explosive strength, or a variety of others depending on the sport. Now, in the strictest interpretations of block periodization, each period would be 100% dedicated to a specific physical quality, and each period would be organized in such a manner as so that the previous block carries over positively into the next block. So on the one hand, we have the complex parallel periodization approach where all physical attributes are developed simultaneously. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the block periodization approach where each physical attribute is trained in isolation. As you may have already guessed, for most of us, it's going to be appropriate to use something in between these two extremes. One very intelligent periodization scheme is the pendulum or emphasis approach. And the way that this works is quite simple. For example, early in the off-season, hypothetically, a powerlifter may dedicate, say, 67% of their training towards muscular hypertrophy and 33% towards improving maximal strength. Towards the end of the training cycle, as they're approaching the contest, that emphasis would shift to 67% maximal strength, 33% hypertrophy, just as an example with numbers. The key takeaway here is that both attributes are developed simultaneously, but the loading is concentrated in one particular direction. It is my opinion that the pendulum emphasis approach is going to be optimal for most powerlifters with several years of training experience. Okay guys, let's bring this all home. The first consideration that we always have is the competitive plan. When is the next meet? How many weeks do we have? What classification of athlete are we? If we're a novice, very little manipulation is going to be required. We can use the same volume and intensity from workout to workout, and we can use complex parallel periodization. We're basically going to be doing the same thing every time we go to the gym. Now, if we're an intermediate trainee, by definition, we're going to require variety in terms of programming. Most intermediate programs call for accumulation phases, which is higher volume, and intensification phases, which is lower volume but with heavier weight. Depending on how advanced you are as an intermediate trainee, you might be operating within a weekly mesocycle, such as the Texas method. Or, on the other hand, you might be a little bit more advanced and use a monthly mesocycle, such as Jim Wendler's 5-3-1. But in either case, the most appropriate periodization plan for the intermediate trainee is still going to be complex parallel periodization. It's only once an athlete enters into the advanced stages that more complex forms of periodization become necessary. For the advanced athlete, the volumes required to stimulate progress in each specific physical attribute, or even lift, are so high, they're going to need periods of emphasis on a particular quality or a particular lift because they cannot develop everything at the same time anymore. So not only does the athlete have to employ more complex periodization, but then they have to layer that in with appropriate variety in intensity and volume in order to meet the objectives of their particular periodization plan at the allotted times in their training cycle.
I really wanted to give you guys at least one visual example of how this all works out. So here's a basic flowchart for you here. You can see with the novice, their periodization focus is complex parallel. They're develop everything simultaneously. Programming wise, they do the same thing workout to workout. At the next level of training complexity for the intermediate, you can see that there's variety in the programming. It shifts from a high volume approach towards a higher intensity approach. And then you can see only once we get to advanced do we start combining that variety in programming in terms of progressing from high volume to high intensity, while also simultaneously having different focuses for each mesocycle, such as hypertrophy, speed, or strength.
I know that training organization is an incredibly dense topic. I did my best to simplify this and make it comprehensible. However, if there's any subject that you're still unclear about, please feel free to ask any questions that you have. I read and answer all of them. If you guys found this content interesting, informative, or entertaining, please like, share, and send it out into the interwebs for me. It helps a lot. Subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to check out PowerliftingToWin.com for more great powerlifting information. Have a nice day.